Now listen, I mentioned to you last night, and I got thank you so much for Rory for setting this up for me. But this is that website, and I'm just the only reason I have you here. You get there by jdbookmanministries.com, and can you see up here in the right-hand corner? There's a word that says links. So if you click on that, I do this because I want everybody to know about my really big muscle-up website, right? No, there's nothing to this website. But just to have a way to electronically get you to that Dropbox. So if you go there, hit links, one of the links it'll take you to is here, Resources on the Life of Christ, occasionally updated. Now, where that will take you is to a Dropbox. I'm gonna walk you through this just real quickly. And again, I forgive the hubris to whatever degree that's there, but I am jealous for you to understand the life of Jesus, and I think you will find it as soul refreshing as anything you've ever done to get closer and closer to understand the life Jesus lived. And this should open up into a Dropbox link. It's being very, very slow. I don't know exactly why. But let me just tell you that Dropbox link, if you open any document or whatever in Dropbox, it's clunky. You can move it around, so what you want to do, it won't open for me, is go to download, and then it'll download as a document, and you can save it. I absolutely no, for what it's worth, proprietary impulse. You don't have to worry about it. You're not taking anything from me. Put it to any use you can. Share it. But I will just show you, here is the actual Dropbox. And that's what it'll look like. You can't see that very well, but there's a lot of, even those, listen, that was the weirdest thing. When we all went into temporary forced hibernation, and had no idea what was going on. Remember back then where we really didn't know. Now the fact that we know it now, we keep it up is a different thing. But the fact that we're well into fool me twice territory, I keep saying. But on the other hand, so my daughter said, a lot of people are just going online and doing things. Why don't you do something? I never heard of Facebook Live. I didn't know it existed, and I perpetually demonstrated how unfamiliar I was with it as I went through it. But all of that's there, and others who have, Nate, I appreciate it, and they could help you as well. Again, it has, please don't think of it as having anything to do with me. What the issue is, and I'll tell you something, by reason of the fact, I mentioned this yesterday, I don't want to get into it, this is seminary stuff, but not that you can't handle seminary stuff, but we're doing Life of Christ. But by reason of the fact that the whole evangelical world has bought an understanding of the Gospels that removes their eyewitness character and that questions their absolute historical reliability, people don't study the life of Jesus. Very important scholars whose name you might well recognize. I don't know how I moved the accent there, but scholars, with good standing, argue that there's no use trying to reconstruct the life of Jesus. It just can't be done. Just look at an individual pericope, event, passage, and so on, but don't try and relate them one to another. Well, you're not going to have anything even approximately a life if you don't do that. And just very quickly, the reason is because they will argue that the broad stories and the teaching is true, but the narrative and especially the details on the margin, I call it, you can't trust those. That's what you need to harmonize. Makes sense to you? In other words, it's when you see these little connections that are clear, that's how you harmonize. But if you don't believe those are dependable, you're not going to harmonize. And so I'm making a point that the evangelical world, okay, I'm an old guy. When I was in seminary, or even, through the early years of my ministry, it seemed like every 2 or 3 years, a major life of Christ, a book tracing the life of Christ would appear. Some scholar would have, and we'd kick it around and compare it and so on. I don't think there's been one for 30 years, honest to goodness. There are studies in the life of Christ that turn out to be synoptic studies and so on. But all right, so Enough of that. All right, let me take you then. That's not helping. Let me take you back to our PowerPoint. And I'll start right here. This is the outline we're going to use. And let me just rehearse very quickly. I appreciate I kept you up late last night, and here you are early this morning. But just very quickly, you remember that I like to think of Sunday as a day of Messianic presentation. Now, there are 2 Sundays. The Passion Week, have you ever thought about this? Why do we call it the Passion? Is that intuitive to you? It might be the more so if you were raised on the King James. How many of you read the King James and are man enough to admit it, I like to say. But yeah, I love the King James. I know. But at any rate, I think the reason that in the English-speaking world we've come to refer to the events around Jesus' death and resurrection and so on is because of the King James translation of Acts 1, where Dr. Luke says that Jesus showed himself alive after his passion. You remember that? And it's a good translation. Most modern translations don't use that term there. After his suffering it'll have, or after his agony. But the old King James used the word passion, and out of that, I think, has come as almost universal, I don't know, use of the word passion to refer to the events of Jesus' suffering. And the week that tells that story is referred to as the Passion Week, as you know. And, you know, if there are dramas telling us the Passion Play and so on. But what I was going to say is that the Passion Week is an 8-day week. And if it were not, we wouldn't be here today. That makes sense to you? So there's the first Sunday, and then there is of course, Resurrection Sunday. So the first Sunday, Triumphal Entry, Palm Sunday, we're referring to as a day of Messianic presentation. And again, the scene was set, and I didn't drive this home very carefully, but I want to take just a moment. Remember, we started last night by looking at that passage in Luke 13 where Jesus in Perea, in response to those Pharisees who come over with their cheap little trick, trying to lure Jesus back into Judea. Remember, Judea, Pilate, the Jews can make him do what they want. Perea, Antipas, they got no leverage there. So they're trying to get him out of there. I want to do something. I don't know. But let me take you to that passage, because Luke 13, I'm going to go back to it. Oh, well, nuts. I started to open this and forgot. Hold on. I'm going to open my Bible. I forgot. So if you go to Luke 13, you know, I will make this point again and again, that I said last night, it's so important to read the Bible in terms of its own culture. The Bible is not a culture-bound book. It will work in any culture. It is a culture-based book. It's based in a culture which is very different than ours. And it's history, it's real history, and history plays out in the midst of a people and a place and a geography and so on. So you have to understand, I mean, you're going to be hugely advantaged, and the black and white story is going to become technicolor to you to the degree that you really begin to ponder it from its own culture. And it's a fun culture. There's so many, but one of the things I like to point out here, now let me just check. In Luke 13 and verse 31, you have this story of the Pharisees. Now I'm jumping back here, forgive me, shame on me, but of the Pharisees when they, is that big enough? Can you see that? Can you handle that? Because I can make it bigger. But this is what he says in the red here. He says, go tell that fox. And then he says, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow and the third day. Well, the third day I'll be perfected. Then he says, nevertheless, I'm going to journey today, tomorrow, and the day following. And commentators quite frankly, look at that and they say, we don't have any idea what he's talking about because we don't know about his day-by-day schedule to have any idea what he's talking about. And it was certainly more than 3 days later that he made his way over there to raise Lazarus from the dead. That's the next thing that happens after this. Listen, the New Testament writers, here's another hobby horse number. It's high on the list. I think it's 4 or 5. But the New Testament writers wrote in Greek. They thought in Hebrew. They think Old Testament thoughts. The best way to understand the New Testament is to saturate your mind with the Old Testament in every way. And the Old Testament, here's another little curiosity, and I'm going to get to work. The Bible was written for an oral culture. In other words, it was written to be read aloud. Most people didn't have, people get after, in antiquity, people were illiterate and so on. Well, in a lot of cases they were, but it was because there was hardly anything in life more expensive than a book, for heaven's sake. You didn't have any books. You had to go and listen to it being read. That's how you learned. And they had an amazing capacity in an oral culture. I like to say that you could take a guy off the docks of Caesarea Maritima from Jesus' day, and if you could bring him whole here, he would make a huge pile of money as a performer in nightclubs and so on, doing feats of human memory that we would regard as superhuman. And he'd say, what are you talking about? Honest to goodness. That's just how they learned. Now, having said it, because it's an oral culture, think about this. The author of the text who's telling a story has to build into the words on the page whatever he wants of nuance, of emphasis, of question, everything he wants. He can't. There are no punctuation marks. And besides, you can't depend on the inflection of the reader. He may get it wrong. So everything has to be built in, and Hebrew especially. Greek is not so much, but Hebrew has the most amazing panoply or catalog of literary devices and clever ways, and one of them is called because I'm asking, what does Jesus mean when he says to those Pharisees, I'm going to walk today and tomorrow, and on the third day, I'll be perfected? What do you mean by that? Well, one of the ways in which Hebrew now this is Greek, but Jesus his mind, if you don't mind, snores in Hebrew. I don't know, but I made that part up, obviously. I don't know if he snored or not, but I'm saying that the Hebrew Bible just came out of every pore. And so he thinks in Hebrew categories. And the fact is, there is a means of emphasizing usually completeness. Something comes to fullness in the Hebrew called are you ready for this? The numerical progression. Never heard of that? But you have. Finish this for me. 6 things the Lord hates. What? Talk to me. Yea, 7 are an abomination. 3 things I don't understand. Yea, 4 are more than I can comprehend. For 2 transgressions of Moab, yea, for 3. Now, the numbers are not important, and it certainly doesn't mean that God only hates those 7 things. It means he really hates these 7 things. It doesn't mean that these are the only sins Moab committed, but they filled up their cup. You know what I'm saying? So it's fullness. So what is Jesus saying? Everybody would have understood what he's saying. What he is saying is, I'm not going to fall for your little trick. I'm going to, today, tomorrow, and on the third day. In other words, when the time is full. I will come when the time is full. Does that make sense to you? And again, there are just all sorts of ways that bring the Old Testament with you. But learn the culture. All right, Rory, I'm going to take a minute. One other thing. This is just a thing with me. I feel like I got a lot of time because we get to go till 7 o'clock tonight. But folks, I'm going to go above my pay grade. Okay, I wasn't paid to do this. I don't know what I'm paid to do, for heaven's sakes. And by the way, thank you for your bringing me here. Thank you for letting me be part of the church, and I'm so well cared for. But can I encourage you? Be careful about what version of the Bible you read from regularly, that you study from. Because, there are these, this is way beyond what I should be talking about, but there are these 2 basic philosophies of translation, and perhaps you've been through this, But on the one hand, there is what's called formal. I don't like that. Hold on here. There is formal translation, and on the other hand, there is dynamic. And formal translation, and what we're talking here is certainly the King James, certainly the New King James, certainly the NASB, New American Standard, and certainly, but in a way that I'm dissatisfied with the ESV, okay? But I would recommend those. We're not talking about the New International. I'm not saying they're wicked, but don't make them your primary study Bible. And I'll tell you why, among other things. Formal, dynamic, it tries to be word for word, whereas dynamic tries to be thought for thought. As a matter of fact, dynamic translation, they try and take the thought of the passage and put it in terms and ideas that you would immediately understand. Now, what has to happen for him to do that? See, in order to do that, the translator has to interpret for you. He has to decide what you don't want your translator to interpret. You want to know what the scripture says. Now, I could show you all sorts of illustrations, but the big one, and this is what I'm after. The formal translation demands that the reader step into the culture of the text, whereas dynamic tries to bring the text into the culture of the reader. So it deliberately modernizes. So you get, this is the illustration I always use, you get a translation. It was called, when I was a kid in Rockford, Illinois, in a good church, and we were, and we were given these little Bibles to hand out to our friends and so on, these little New Testaments, and they also had some Psalms. And because it was called the Blue Denim Bible, it had a blue denim cover, it's for the guy in the street, kid in the street. And Psalm 23:1 was, "The Lord is my traffic cop." Now, you see, there are so many things wrong with that. It makes your eyes water, right? I mean, for heaven's sakes. But do you hear what's going on there? Kid doesn't know what a shepherd is. And so you go to the Museum of the Bible, and I love it. It's in Washington, D.C., but they have a whole section on translation, and very, very positively, they're very thrilled with this. They have a little apparatus that they did when I was there. You could spin, and it showed you various ways in which various, especially with unreached peoples, that they translated John 1:29, "Behold the Lamb of God." And about half of them, you go this language, so on, about half of them, because the people being reached weren't familiar with lambs, never seen a lamb, and when they do any sort of ritual, they'd use a pig. So it became, "Behold the swine of God that takes away the sin of the world." Now, not only, that's going to cause so much. Now, those are kind of radical examples, but so here's where I'm taking you. Learn to read the Bible in terms of its own culture. And one of the best things you can do is read a version which gives you exactly what it says, and if it's foreign to your culture, it asks you to step into that culture. Does that make sense to you? That's a healthy exercise. The Amplified is an animal unto itself. I think the Amplified is a good study tool. I don't think it's very good. It's clunky, gives all those synonyms and so on. Now here's a problem. Oh, Bookman is in such trouble here. But here's a problem is that any word has what's called a semantic range. It can be used in a lot of different ways. I don't know. Think of the word, pick one, but in any given context, only one of those words' meaning is intended. And so one of the things, the habits of mind that I think the Amplified may get us into is that it could mean any one of these things. Well, the word is liable to any one of those meanings, but in this context, it means only one of those. That makes sense to you? And that's the way we use language, So if if I stand here and say, you know, I took too much time talking, that I'm really in a box now. You know what I'm saying? If you say, well, that could mean a literal box. No, it doesn't mean a literal box. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense. You know, so that was a poor example. All right, now, oh my goodness, shame on me. All right, now I'm going to get to business. And I'm going to go back to this PowerPoint. And again, let me just pick it up right here. So I gotta change my settings here. So Sunday, and we said that there were these two events. One is Jesus, and here's what I started to say and interrupted myself, which I want to do all too much. But the fact is that the prophecy that Jesus made there in Perea, you're not going to see me until you welcome me as Messiah, till you cry out, Psalm 118, verse 25, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, verse 24, I think. Like I say, you'd have been there, you'd have thought, that's not going to happen. It happened. And it happened because Jesus was clever enough to alert the city to his coming in that midst of all that excitement which was exacerbated almost beyond what we can imagine by the miracle of Lazarus. Raising Lazarus from the tomb is in John's mind, that's where the Passion narrative starts. Now, we're 2 or 3 weeks before the Passion narrative, but nonetheless, John goes on and say that that's when Jesus became a fugitive. The Sanhedrin got together and said, we got to arrest him, put out a notice. That's when the whole city was set to, a Twitter over the question, is the Messiah, is the Nazarene going to come? And Jesus betakes himself, if you don't mind, to little village of Ephraim. Then we talked about it. And here, I'll show it to you. This is probably, here is the, all right, watch. Here are the two routes. Remember, Galilee way to the north, Samaria in between Galilee and Samaria and Judea to the south. Judea is where Jerusalem is. That's where all these hundreds of thousands of Galilean Jews got to get in order to keep the Passover. And so they would come down into the Jezreel Valley, and then they would make their way. Now, this is the ridge route that they would like to take, but it goes right through Samaria. You can't be doing that. So they have to take this route that takes them down the Harod Valley, the shaft of the arrow, as it were, then down the eastern side of the Jordan Rift, and then back up to Jerusalem. And you're coming up from the east. Again, the backside, like the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. And again, think about this. When they are here, when they cross the river right there, they are at 1,300 feet below sea level. It's the lowest spot on the face of the earth by far. By the way, the next lowest is like 400 feet other than this rift. And when they cross right here into Jerusalem, they are at 2,300 feet above sea level. So, no, 2,700 feet. So, and it's about 15 miles. So in 15 miles, you're going to climb from 13, that's a 4,000 foot ascent in 15 miles. It is flat. Remember, Jesus said there was a man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. You're flat going down. So I'm saying that you'd much rather take the ridge route, but you can't. But on the other hand, here's Jesus. Here's what we talked about on last night. Forgive me. Jesus starts out from Ephraim. Today it's called Ophrah. And it's a remarkable little city. But at any rate, Jesus made his way because he had earned standing in Samaria. So he moves up through Samaria. He can get away with this. And then falls in with one of those bands of Passover pilgrims and makes his way just the same route that we talked about. It's going to take him 4 or 5 days. And he times his steps to arrive in Bethany, just outside the Sabbath zone, on Friday. So now all these people who are traveling with him, they don't want to be left out there in Bethany on Shabbat. There's no place for them to be. So they're going to go on into the city, and they have 2 days. They get there sometime on Friday, all day Saturday. They're telling all their friends, everybody who, what's the city asking? Is he coming? He is coming. He'll be here Sunday morning. And thus, as Jesus rides into the city, I go back to what Thomas said some weeks earlier. Stay with me now. But remember when Jesus earlier had said, we're going to go to attend to Lazarus. And Thomas said, well, let's go die with him. Well, it's more dangerous now than it was then, because after Lazarus was raised, you remember the official Jewish leadership said we're going to put him to death. And I wonder what it must have been. You know, you're one of those disciples, and you follow Jesus, and you know that the most powerful men in the Jewish world are intent on his death, and you're making your way up, and you stop in Bethany, and you stay there for Shabbat, and then on Sunday morning, you fetch the donkey, and he gets on the donkey, and now again you can do. You know, we used to do this. We used to go to Bethany and talk about this, and then walk down to. You can't anymore because of the wall. You know, Bethany is behind the wall. But at any rate, you got to walk all the way down to Jericho and then walk all the way back up to get through that wall. But the point is that I just wonder if the disciples themselves. Here you are, you're coming up, and you would have heard the rumble and a lot of commotion over there, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, they probably got an army waiting for us, you know. And then you top the hill, and here are tens of thousands of people throwing down their garments, waving the palm fronds, crying out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Can you imagine if you're one of those disciples? I would say that this Passion Week is the most gut-wrenching emotional roller coaster any man ever endured, you know. But anyway, I'll come back to that. So that was on Sunday morning. Now I want to stop. I need to say real quickly, this is something else happened on Saturday night. It's going to be very important, and I want to talk to you about it. Now let me check in your notes. I've got this in your notes. So let's actually pretend we got notes here in front of us. So page, yeah, my pagination evidently is a little 7, yeah, page 7. So I say at the bottom of that page, on page 7, now this is Saturday, or it's the weekend, because what I'm talking about here is Friday to Sunday on the top of the page, and I make the point, matter of fact, I can do this too, if I were any kind of a teacher. Because here are these notes. And so here on page 7, I'll give you some background. By the way, this chart right here you have in your notes, it can be helpful. Ponder it a little bit. I just try and lay out all of the events of each day, and then I give you kind of the same chart here where I give you the days and so. But anyway, it can be helpful. But here is page 7. And I mentioned that Jesus arrives in Bethany on Friday, and he brings these twofold message. He is coming. He'll be here Sunday morning. But on Saturday night, now there's some confusion about this. I'm not going to take the time to walk you through all of it, but believe me, there's really no question. To this day, this is very, very much the weekly pattern in an observant Jewish home. Friday, it's interesting, and this will become important later on. Friday is the only day of the week with a name in the Jewish world. They number the days of the week. Sabbath means seventh, right? Jesus rose on the first day of the week. The only day with a name is Friday, and it's called the day of preparation. And the reason it's called the day of preparation is because now you know that the Old Testament law said that on the Sabbath you're to do no work, but it doesn't very carefully define what work is. Well, the rabbis didn't leave that alone, did they? So they have all these long lists of what constitutes work. And on Friday afternoon, as I understand, I've never seen it happen, but as I understand, in an Orthodox Jewish home, there's a drawer where there's a pile of little black cloths. And on Friday afternoon, the kids will go and get those cloths, and they'll hang a cloth over every mirror in the house. And the reason is because if they don't cover their mirrors, maybe one of the women will walk by and forget it's Sabbath and see a gray hair and pluck it, and that would be reaping. And so they very carefully cover their mirrors. And I mean, it's just so many. Well, and the point is this, that whatever you're going to do on Saturday, even today you can't get in a car on the Sabbath. And you know why? Because the Bible does say explicitly, Moses said that you're not to start a fire. And a car has a spark plug. And therefore, there's a fire. That's why you can't turn on a light switch, because there's a switch. So my point is, and the Jewish cycle of life is that the weekend is Friday and Saturday. Usually they'll go to their shops on Friday morning, but they'll go home about noon, and they have to prepare everything. I'm saying that you have to get everything ready, what you're going to eat, what lights you want on, and so on. Whatever you want on Shabbat, you have to prepare for on Fridays. Does that make sense to you? Because then, as the sun goes down on Friday, folks, are you Fiddler on the Roof fans? And if not, shame on you, for heaven's sakes. But go home and watch that movie. But it so reflects Jewish. It's such a good, I love the story. It's a great story, but it's so Jewish. But you remember as it begins, Tevye's coming home with a lame horse and the whole thing. You remember, and the girls are putting on their Sabbath best, and then make me a match. Remember that song they're singing as they are, and then they is that what it is? I can't remember, but they're anyway. The mother is down there getting everything ready and barking at Tevye and so on, and then they all gather around and she says the prayers, covers her head and so on. That's the coming in of Shabbat. So you gather as a family and you welcome Shabbat. Now, on the other hand, as the sun goes down on Saturday, there is the going out of Shabbat. And what happens on Saturday night, it's to this day, it's kind of fun to do. I don't remember if we did this in Jerusalem, but people will go out, and today you can go up to Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem, which is kind of the open mall, and it'll be like a ghost town before the sun goes down. Within about an hour after the sun goes down, all the shops are open, all the street musicians are out, every kid's walking around, and so it's the coming out of Shabbat. Now, what am I taking you there? That's what happens with this feast. You see, Jesus arrives on Friday, keeps the Sabbath. Now, Jesus, you can't buy a Jesus poster in Bethany, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, they're all sold out. I mean, Jesus is the biggest hero Bethany has ever known. And he raised one of their favorite sons just a few weeks ago. So now, unexpectedly, they show up for Shabbat. And undoubtedly, what happened is the word went out, the Nazarene is here. Well, let's plan a feast as the sun goes down. So it's on Saturday night that they her for a feast. It's not at Lazarus's home, though Martha is serving, and it seems because it was, her brother's kind of the guest of honor along with Jesus. But at any rate, at that feast, and where is the feast? Do you remember? At the home of, I don't know, what is it? Simon, which is it, Dave? Simon the, remember, it's at the home of Simon the leper. You get an invitation, come on over, Simon the leper. We say maybe finger foods, who knows? No, that's a cheap joke. But the point is that I don't think Simon's a leper anymore. He's not a leper anymore. He's living in a cave outside of town. I don't know. Maybe he too has good reason to rejoice over the Nazarene. You know what I'm saying? But at any rate, they gather, and it's at that feast that Mary anoints Jesus. Let me tell you something. There are two, talking about the culture, there are two elements of modern life that we take every bit for granted, and appropriately enough, that were very rare in the Old Testament. I'm sorry, in the biblical world. And they are scent and color. Beautiful, bright colors and rich, deep aromas. Yeah, they were very expensive. And so for Mary to take that, if you'd have been there, and they didn't live in the houses always, there was a courtyard. You did most of the living in the courtyard. But there they are, they're having this feast, and people are standing around perhaps, and many of them are gathered around Jesus, and Mary makes her way up. And I'm going to tell you something, when she took that vial of expensive oil and just broke the seal, everybody within 10 feet, I think, would have stopped that quick and said, wow, what is that? And you might have expected that she would just take a little bit of a dab, which would have been so loving, and just refresh Jesus' forehead with it. She begins to slather that oil, and now that smell would have erupted throughout the place, and everybody would have stopped and so on. And I'm going to tell you something. You and I would have wondered about the propriety of, and everybody. The Bible says everybody, including all the apostles, said, Mary, what are you doing? And by the way, Jesus replied, and when you have the words on the page, Jesus said, let her alone. She has done this. And I know that a lot of people think he's barking at them. Hey, shut up, leave her alone. I don't think there was any of that. I think, in fact, that everybody's surprise and kind of a little bit of horror was not unreasonable, for heaven's sakes. And I think Jesus very lovingly said, no. Let her do it. She's done this against the day of my burial. Now, I haven't made much of this, but Jesus never mentions his death until about 7 months before he dies. And when he does, his disciples are not only incredulous, they are scandalized. They're mad at him. Matthew 16:21 is where it says that Jesus got alone with his disciples at in the region of a place called Caesarea Philippi, and told them that I'm going to take him to Jerusalem, suffer many things of the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day I'll rise again. And you remember the next verse says, Matthew 16:22, the next verse says that Peter took Jesus. Now what it says literally is he took Jesus to himself. It's a compound verb there. He took Jesus to himself. And most translations have, he took him aside. Like he put his arm around him and said, now we need to talk about it. I don't think so at all. I think he took him to himself like this. I think he grabbed him and said, don't be talking that way. So, I mean, the point is that Jesus again and again, as a matter of fact, that verse in Matthew 16:21 says, from that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how he must die and be raised again. Well, that would suggest, and it exactly reflects the Greek, that he had never done it before, but once he did it over and over again. And that's exactly what you have in the scriptures. So beginning about 6 or 7 months before Jesus' death, he began to tell his disciples, even the angels who encountered the women at the why are you looking for him? He's alive. He's as he told you again and again. So Jesus again and again had said, I'm going to die, and on the third day I'll rise again. Every time he mentions his death, he says, on the third day I'll rise again. You want an index of how thoroughly they didn't get it. When you might have thought that maybe one or two of the disciples would remember that and say, it's awful, I can't believe it, but he did say it right. Let's go hide behind a tree and see what happens. None of that. They absolutely missed it. So here's where I'm taking you. Jesus had begun appropriately enough, and I'd love to talk to you about this, but there's a good reason for this. But Jesus had begun only about 6 or 7 months before his death to start talking about it. He talked about it again and again. There's one person in the record who gets it, and that's Mary. And that's why he says, wherever this is remembered, she'll be remembered, because can you imagine what a heaviness it was to Jesus' heart? That no matter how carefully he foretold, they wouldn't hear it. And here's this one sweet sister who gets it. And so now that's on Saturday night. Now, as I said, there were everybody in the room reacted in the same way. What are you thinking about? And Jesus, I think, lovingly, patiently, gently rebuked him and said, no. Leave her alone. She's done this against the day of my burial. But there was one guy, and only one. Jesus didn't even direct that directly at Judas. But you see, Judas, don't try to rescue Judas, all right? Judas loved his sin more than he loved what he knew to be the truth. And that's the, forgive me, only ticket to hell. The only way you get there is to defy what you know to be the truth. I don't care who you are and what kind of dark jungle you live in. There is truth that God has set before you manifestly, and it's compelling truth. And if you respond to it, the Spirit of God, God's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him, and so on. But Judas, who had more truth than about any man who ever lived, was a thief. And he loved his sin more than He loved what he knew to be the truth. And so he had rejected it. Now, he was a good imposter. And we'll come to it in just a bit. But the fact is that this is a theme. Never forget this. Young people, never forget this. Sin makes you stupid. And what I mean by that is that you cling to your sin and everything gets distorted. The way you think, the way you feel, the way you react, everything. It just makes you morally and quite frankly, intellectually stupid. You'll believe the most ridiculous lies because you love your sin. And Judas had loved his sin. And so my point is that the one guy in the room who took personal offense was Judas. And he, he kept the bag. He too said, Mary, you shouldn't have done this. You should have given it to the poor. But he was going to skim some of that for himself. That's what was at stake with him. So it was on Saturday night that there is a feast where Mary anoints Jesus. Everybody gets after Mary. Jesus gently rebukes those who are getting, and Judas takes it very personally. Does that make sense to you? That's going to become important. Yeah.
Before you...
That's all right. I love it.
Just a second. Matthew and Mark says the home of Simon the leper, but John says the home where Lazarus lived. So I was wondering, are they related?
Some have conjectured that, and it could be that it was a clan situation, and so they lived in the same villa, estate, and so on. But let me go to it real quickly. This is excellent. So John chapter 12. So they made him a feast. There they made him a supper. So, all right, now I'm going to get personal, okay? What translation are you reading? The prosecution rests. No, it doesn't say. See, this is a problem, and look, I have the NKJV, which is kind of the KJV redone, and everybody knows the KJV is the real Bible, right? No, I'm teasing. I don't believe that, but the point is, it is very, very formal, and it doesn't say he lived there. It just says where Lazarus was. Does that make sense to you?
Mine says lived, so I can send you a different one.
It says lived.
Lived, yeah.
That's where the NIV is kind of interpreting for you.
Yeah.
It's representing as where he lived. Oh, it says he was there at the feast. That's what it says.
Oh, mine says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived.
All right, time out. I was being too hard on it. I think that maybe the reference there is to Bethany and not the house. So he did, in fact, live there. And that's what is being said here. Now, I will say that even at that, and it's okay, I think that's a legitimate representation of what's at stake here. Listen, I have the spiritual gift of talking out of both sides of my mouth, and I'm about to do that. But if you're going to do dynamic equivalence, the NIV does it better than anybody else. They're less radical. They're not the Living Bible or the Message or something. So, and I think, and the NIV translators were honest, good men who wanted to, but I think they go too far. But I think there is probably, where Lazarus lived in terms of Bethany. Yeah, that's good to get that straightened out. Dave, what were you going to say?
Well, the Greek is from Amy, so.
Remaining.
It's from Amy. He was.
Yeah, just where he was, yeah. So the point is that this is what it actually says, right? Where Lazarus was. Now you can kind of say, well, does that mean he was in the house, or does that mean that was his village, or so on? I'd kind of rather it didn't try and specify it for you, as long as it's not specified in the original. Yeah, good point. All right, very good. All right, I don't mean to beat up on you. Well, turns out I did. What am I talking about? But all right, so Saturday night now. The reason I stress it is because I'll leave it alone for now, Saturday night. All right, so let's go back to work. And now, so much of this is so much fun to talk about that I get bogged down. But let me take you then to, so this is the question I left you with and kept you up all night long. Given Sunday, why Friday? Well, if the question is, given Sunday, you know what I'm saying? Given the fact they welcomed him on Sunday, why are they crying for his crucifixion on Friday? The answer I like to say is Monday and Tuesday, which are days of Messianic proclamation. Now, I have a lot of notes, and I'm going to abandon this. You can go here to, this is the triumphal entry where I give you some of the background and so on. But here are these 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, days of Messianic proclamation. And listen, I am going to do inexcusable damage to these. I mean, we're going to go very quickly. I love these 2 days. I really suggest spend some time. This is exciting. I always say, if you came to me with one free pass on your newly invented time machine, I think I'd dial up Monday and Tuesday. I'm not kidding. This is stunning. This is a show. But I'm going to be very quick. So I'm going to walk you through it and as I said to you yesterday, folks, what I'm really hungry for is that you really begin to get your arms around the narrative, and you can think through this week. And a lot of the details you can work on, in days to come. But here's what happens. Number one, and let me say this: Jesus stays in Bethany. That is brilliant, because there is in this culture, and it's the same today. I used to travel in Israel with a bus driver by Nael. I love Nael, and he had come to the Lord, but he was a total flake, and so I had to. But he was Bedouin. And Bedouin is the Arabic word for desert. He never lived on the desert, but his parents came off the desert, and he understood Bedouin culture. And I would get him talking about Bedouin culture sometime, and this is the point he'd always make. He'd say, "If I invite you into my house, I am duty bound at whatever cost to protect you. And there could be nothing that would bring greater shame, not just on me, but on my family, on my clan, than if I were to take you into my house." Now, this shows up at least twice in the Bible, and it's kind of gut-wrenching for us. First of all is Lot. Remember when the wicked men, they're in Sodom and so on, and he offers his daughters. You think, who does this? And then there's this wicked priest who's gone to fetch his concubine in Judges 19 and gets to Gibeah, and the men come and finally they take his concubine and throw her out, remember, and they abuse her all night long. And I'm not saying it's noble. I'm not saying it's excusable. I think in both of those cases it's wicked, but it is a function of the culture that the host is absolutely duty-bound to protect you. Now, think about what that means. Jesus goes to Bethany. Bethany is just off the main road coming up from the east. There's always going to be all sorts of traffic there. So Jesus can just step out of Bethany, and he's going to be surrounded by these people who adore him. And remember now, what's at stake is that both the Jewish and the Roman leadership doesn't want a riot. That's what's at stake. And so again and again, I told you before, Jesus is a fugitive. He has to be so circumspect. He has to plan his steps. This is really clever. So Bethany is genius. And the point being that if they try to go down under cover of night and spirit Jesus out of the home of Lazarus, that whole village is going to take up arms, and they're going to have a major riot, and everybody knows. That makes sense to you? So Jesus every night goes back to Bethany. And because of the crowds, even along the way, he's perfect. It's about 1.25 miles from the walls through to Bethany. But you're just going right up the Mount of Olives and then just on the other side. So Jesus on Monday morning comes in. He sees the fig tree. He curses the fig tree. All right, you remember this story? I mentioned it before, that fig trees blossom kind of continually, kind of erratically. But there's one harvestable season of figs, and that's the summer figs. And that's where you prune the tree and you get all the old stuff off and so on. You prepare the tree. Now, the signal for it's time to begin to prepare for the summer fruit is when those blossoms come. And because of the nature of fig trees, if you got summer blossoms, you ought to have winter figs. You will have winter figs. And so Jesus, all right, here's something else. Don't talk about it. But the Jews they don't eat in the morning. They don't begin the day with a meal. Some do today because they've been westernized, but that culture, it's a culture that's built around a hot sun. So you want to be at work, in the fields, at wherever you're going to be working, you want to be there before the sun comes up. So you get up and you go to work, and then when the sun gets hot, it's the siesta concept, you go in. And by the way, when you go in mid-morning, about 10 o'clock, you go find some shade and rest and so on. That's when you have your first meal of the day. That's also when the morning sacrifice. Remember, every day there was a morning and evening sacrifice. First one was mid-morning, and that's when you would pray. That's the time of prayer and so on. Then you have a meal and rest, and then you'd wait for the sun to get past its apex, and then you would go out once again, work till the sun went down, and then come in and have a second meal. So my point is that the Jews did not begin the day with a meal, but you might snack. And that was perfectly legitimate. And one of the ways you might do that is if you're walking by a grain field, it was perfectly legitimate. Take some of that grain and just get the little, the wheat kernels and so on and snack on those. Or if there were winter figs, because the winter fig is not harvestable. And so you're welcome to go and just get a little bit of the fruit out of it, the meat out of it and so on. So the point is that Jesus sees this fig tree. It's got the blossoms. And it has no figs. And he pronounces a curse. Now, the next morning, that's Monday morning, on Tuesday, according to Mark, very explicit, as he returns to the city, he finds it, they find it withered from the ground up. And now I believe, it makes sense to me, because the Bible is not, Jesus doesn't say this, but I think very possibly, very probably, the reason that fig tree was so, if you don't mind, offensive to Jesus is because it so well represented that generation of Israel. Yesterday, he rode in, and the whole city threw down their palm branches, threw down their coats and waved the palm branches. But Jesus knows by Friday, he knows what's going to happen. He knows their hearts. And so I think but for whatever reason, that's on the way into the city. Now, what he does then, and I'm just going to... what he does is goes into the temple and cleanses the temple. Now, let me just talk to you about this real quickly. This is, I can get lost in this, but the temple in Jesus, all right, Israel in her history has had two temples. The first built by Solomon, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. The second built by, remember this guy, Zerubbabel. He didn't get as much attention as he might, but and it was a horribly disappointing temple, a little tiny thing in an unwalled city made out of wood, and it was an embarrassment. During the intertestamental period, a family called the Hasmoneans cleaned it up some, but Herod remodeled the second temple. So the second temple was built by Solomon, Zerubbabel, Ezra chapter 1, and then remodeled by Herod, and then destroyed. You know that they finally finished building this? Herod died, put it on the record, in 1 BC. I know every book you read is going to say 4 BC. It's not true. It's 1 BC. No, all right, but at any rate, so Herod, who is this great builder, I mean to tell you, he is amazing. He was a genius. Herod is one of the greatest geniuses who ever lived. I'm talking about, there are 4 Herods in the New Testament, but I'm talking about the paterfamilias, right? Granddaddy, the guy who, and that we call him Herod the Great, because Josephus, it means the older. But Herod, because he had a brother named Herod. They did this, and I don't know, I always say there was a lot of George Foreman going on back then. I don't know if that works for you, but George Foreman had 5 boys, and he named them all George Foreman. So, I mean, that was kind of, and it was a different setup. But at any rate, the point is that Herod is worth your time. He's worth studying because he is all over the New Testament. And not personally, because he dies just weeks after Jesus is born. And the only time he actually enters the New Testament record is when he tries to kill the baby Jesus. But his impact, his family, and so on, it is so important as a background. And Herod was a massive builder. He was a genius. He was one of the greatest. And here's the thing. Have you heard the term Pax Romana? You know that word? And it means the Roman peace. And it was established. Have you ever heard of the Temple of Janus in Rome? Probably not. But there was this temple that had been been there since the days of the Republic, 400 years before Christ. And when Rome was at war, the doors were open. And when Rome was at peace, the doors were closed. And it had only been closed a couple of times before, but Augustus closed them. And they stayed closed for 200 years. And that's the Pax Romana. Now, it means Roman peace, but when you think peace, you think of serenity and everybody. That's not what it means at all. It means the forced absence of violence. It was a heavy-handed peace. But my point is this, that before the in the Old Testament, you have all of these kings. And I like to say that most of the kings in the Bible are kinglets. And what I mean by that is not some big, massive guy. He's just got a walled city, and he's got some people who serve him, and over here in the next hill is another walled city. And they're usually fighting with one another, because before Rome, the way to aggrandize yourself as a king was conquest. So you conquer somebody else's walled city. Now you have a bigger, you have a more important king. That's all over with Rome. They're in charge. They're no, you know, there might be local skirmishes. The Samaritans might beat up on the Galileans, but as far as any real, it's not happening. So, beginning with Rome, the way you aggrandize yourself, make yourself more worthy, famous, and so on, is architecture. Architecture is the new conquest. And nobody in the world was better at it than Herod. Nobody. And I've already spent too much time, but suffice it to say that by reason of the land that he conquered, he almost immediately became wealthy beyond calculation. And he had just constant revenue flowing in. And so he was able to engage in these huge buildings, and not only in his domain. He built temples in cities all over the empire. He rebuilt the agora, you know, the walkway with the shops and everything, in Antioch and so on. And all of this was very pleasing to Rome. The Romans loved Herod. They didn't trust him. He was a crook, but they loved him because he kept the money coming at any rate. So he built this marvelous temple. Now, what I'm after actually is just to make this point, that this is a model, by the way, as you might expect. But here, the temple, this entire area is about 36 acres, folks. What's your footprint here, Rory? You got any idea? How many acres you got? Maybe 3? This is 36 acres. And I won't talk anymore about it. Now, this is the temple. The actual temple is that 90-foot building in the middle. But all of these courts and so on, and all these stoas, see those pillared porches all the way around? All of that is designed for public, just people to gather and so on, and they're just beautiful, unspeakably beautiful. And so the point is that on Monday morning, Jesus comes into the city. Now, he had done it earlier in John chapter 2. There are 4 Passovers in the life of Jesus. That is, I'm sorry, in the ministry. There are 4 Passovers which are identifiable in Jesus' ministry. Do you have it somewhere in your kabedza that Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years? If I just ask you how long, do you have that 3.5-year figure? That's entirely a function of the fact that John gives us, or at least alludes specifically and then to 4 Passovers. So the point is, Jesus cleanses the temple at the first Passover, ignores it for the second, and then cleanses it on the 4th Passover. So in John 2, you have that initial cleansing just after the miracle of the water to wine, very early in Jesus' ministry. And then now on Monday morning, he does it again. Now, let me talk to you about it real quickly. Number one, understand that you see somewhere here, I have a chart right here. And I'm just going to stop here. by the way, this PowerPoint is in that Dropbox, so you can have this PowerPoint if that's helpful. But this is everything you need to know about the Pharisees and Sadducees. That's what I like to say. This is everything you need to know. Now, there's a lot more you ought to know, and it's a lot of fun to know. It's very interesting, but you're not getting to first base if you don't understand this about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And quite simply, get this, the Pharisees controlled the synagogue. Now, let's just make sure, all right? Synagogue's not a church. It's not a temple. Synagogue is a place where you come together. Synagoge, that means to gather together, to come together. And by the New Testament, the rabbinical standard was that if you have 10 men who can make a minyan, kind of a quorum. But what it means is if you have 10 adult men who can gather on Sabbath morning without violating the Sabbath day's journey. That makes sense to you? So one of the laws that the Jews had, it's going to become very important, is that you can't travel on the Sabbath day further than a Sabbath day journey. It was somewhere over a mile. Now, the idea is not that you count your steps, and after you've walked a mile, you have to sit down and wait for the sun to go down. The idea is a zone. And wherever you are, when the sun goes down, describe a zone just over a mile, a circle, you're the center, and you can move around freely in there, but you can't leave it. And if you're not in that zone, you can't come in. Does that make sense to you? Now, the Jews were not under obligation. Listen, there is no synagogue in the Old Testament. It arose, we don't know exactly how, but it arose during the intertestamental period, the 400 years after Malachi. But in the New Testament, it's everything. And to this day, the Jews build their life around the synagogue, and they would live clustered around their synagogue. So you wanted to be, does that make sense to you? So if you had 10 men who lived within a tight enough zone that they could gather at a central point, you build a synagogue there. Now, you can't have a synagogue without a copy of the Torah and the 5 books of Moses, and you can't go down to Barnes & Noble and buy that copy. You got to have a scribe to copy it for you. And so you maybe can buy it from another synagogue, but generally you'll hire somebody, you'll train somebody, you'll take a young man and train him and send him off to yeshiva, and he will actually copy it out for you. But the point is, and the scribes, now I don't have scribes here, but scribes were a guild. They were a professional guild. They were copyists. Pharisees, they were a community. They were just people. There was no union card. You didn't pay your dues or anything like that. But the idea was that a Pharisee was a 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week lawkeeper. That's what he did. He kept the law, and he studied it, and he tried to come up with ways he could be more punctilious than he was yesterday. So the lawkeeper, the Pharisees, but the scribes embraced the Pharisaic mentality. So the scribes were a guild, but so you see them together all the time. One, you scribes and Pharisees. They're kissing cousins. They're joined at the hip. They're Siamese. You see what I'm saying? But they're different. They describe different lives and different functions of life. But they are all right. Way too much time. So now the point is that the Pharisees, for that reason, controlled the synagogue. They believed the entire law, including the oral law, the traditions, but here's the point. They were greatly respected. As a matter of fact, it's understated. They were revered. And now think about this. This is going to become so important. The Pharisees taught that the way to be certain of entrance into the kingdom was to keep the law. The Pharisees in there, and they show up in distantly in the Talmudic, the Jewish rabbinical literature and so on, their spirit. And they talk a lot about the grace of God, the grace of Yahweh, but what they meant is God was so gracious, he gave us the law. All we have to do is keep the law, and we can get into the kingdom. And so that was their message. And you read, Jesus gets after them about their public display. They'd come and they'd tear off little vegetables and throw it in, and they'd come and have somebody blow a trumpet before they gave the tithes and so on. And you're thinking, well, how odious is that? No, you got to understand that to the common man, that Pharisee, he's going to coattail me into the kingdom. If I support him, if I make it, they lived on the alms, they didn't work, and if I support him and make that lifestyle possible, then I too. So you see, there's a lot at stake here. The more zealous he is, the more punctilious, the more horribly legalistic that he is about keeping the law, the more certain he is to get into the kingdom, and he's going to coattail me in there. And so they were tremendous, but they were greatly feared. On the other hand, the Sadducees comes from Zadok, an Old Testament, they call themselves Zadokites, but I won't get into it. But the Sadducees, and where you find them in your New Testament, they're the chief priests. And so the point is that the chief priests, or the Sadducees, controlled the temple. Now they did that by bribing the Romans. They told the Roman government how much they could produce in the temple, and then they got what was left over. So they were total unbelievers. They didn't believe in anything, and they were entirely despised and resented, and they returned the favor. Now, here's the point. One of the ways in which go back here, they made the most awful merchandise of the people. Passover is the one of the three feasts. Remember, there are those three feasts, Passover in the spring, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, where it's a pilgrimage feast. The only one that involves a personal family sacrifice is Passover. And that Passover had to be a lamb of certain qualifications and so on. And most people, because they came from all over the world for Passover, most people would buy a lamb once they got there. Well, the chief priests had realized, we got a good thing going for us here, because we can insist that unless you buy from our authorized shepherds, which means what? We're going to get a kickback. Unless you buy from them, we're not going to accept, because after you bought the lamb, then you had to go to present it to the priest. And that's exactly what they did. And so you were paying above market prices. Oftentimes you might get a lamb that wasn't even qualified, but nonetheless they would accept it, because the shepherd, who might just bear a family resemblance, I always say, to the priest, but nonetheless he had sold you this, and so the people knew it. Plus, in order to build this temple, Herod had gotten the Romans to allow him, Herod the Great, the guy who built that, had gotten the Romans to allow him to put a 2-day temple tax on every Jew in the Roman world. And you think, well, big deal. How is he going to collect that? He didn't have to collect that. Every synagogue, every community, they'd get together once a year, and they'd all their 2-day temple tax, and they'd put it with several villages would get together, and they'd hire a security force, and they'd make their way all the way to Jerusalem, and they'd blow the trumpets and so on. Every day. This is the biggest cash cow Herod ever produced, is the temple. So, and that's why Rome was quite protective of it, because this, like I say, this was their cash cow. But at any rate, my point is that the Sadducees agreed to collect that temple tax, but only in the local currency, and then he would charge these horribly. These are the money changers, and they're charging horribly usurious rates. So my point is that the common worshiper, whatever his spiritual condition, he's making his way to Passover, and he knows he's going to get cheated blind, and by the people who are they're the deputized supervisors of the temple. And I would say, you can't go down the street and start the Second Baptist Temple. You know what I'm saying? You're stuck with this one. And so my point being this, that the people despised it. All right, now very quickly. And get past the idea that Jesus' cleansing of the temple was a matter of some momentary pique, that he came in, I can't believe it. It makes me so mad, and just flew into a rage. I think there was righteous anger going on here, but this is strategy. Now, I want you to think about this. Jesus cleanses the temple twice. One other thing I got to tell you. You're familiar with the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin means the council. It usually comes to us in the Bible as the council, or the Senate sometimes in some versions. Every town had a Sanhedrin. It was a town council. The big one, the great Sanhedrin, was in Jerusalem, 70 men, and they controlled everything about common life in Israel. They were in charge. The Romans governed with a heavy fist, but they didn't want to handle your religious matters, your local matters, and so on. So there always had to be somebody, and it was the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin at this point was composed equally. There were 70 men, but it was almost immediately split between Pharisee and Sadducee. They hated each other. They despised each other. And so what happens is, Jesus Oh, but by reason of Jesus' popularity, in order for his Jewish enemies to get Jesus dead, they have to get the Romans involved. That's going to be very important. Does that make sense to you, honestly? File that away for just a minute. Very early in his ministry, suddenly, Jesus, nobody ever heard of this guy. He changed some water to wine at a private funeral, and there was some talk, maybe locally, but now Jesus goes down. That's up in Galilee. He goes down to Jerusalem, down to the temple at Passover, first Passover of his ministry, and he cleanses the temple. Folks, I like to say, if there was a woman in the temple that morning who 6 weeks ago had sextuplets, is that how you say that? This was more exciting than that. I don't care whatever happened in your life, to watch that Nazarene grab those cords and start to throw those money changer table and drive you. Now, how did he get away with it? That quick. He was the hero of the people. You try and do anything to him, you kidding me? You're going to have a riot. And so Jesus cleanses the temple at the very first, and he does, this is strategy. Number one, he catapults himself into Jewish worldwide notoriety. You got to understand, these people have come from every corner of the Jewish world. They're getting on a bus and going home, and there's nothing they're going to be talking about except this crazy Nazarene who, you never saw anything like it. So that quick, everybody is talking about Jesus of Nazareth. But that quick, he is one of the greatest heroes the Jewish people ever knew. And so his enemies can't touch him. That makes sense to you? They wanted to take him. They could not because they feared the people. So that's the first cleansing. You tell me, Bible quiz. When he cleansed the temple when he cleansed the temple, either time, but when he cleansed the temple in John chapter 2, whose turf is he on? Sadducees or Pharisees? Come on, talk to me. It's on Sadducean turf, right? The Sadducees are on the temple. All right. How do you think the Pharisees felt about that? I'm sure this is great. Can't get enough of this, for heaven's sakes. Now, interestingly, for 2 years, Jesus doesn't touch the temple. But what's he doing? Synagogue to synagogue. Now whose turf is he on? And you can watch this happen in the pages of the Gospels where the Pharisees, not the Sadducees, what do they care? They're probably saying, hey, we're having fun now. But the Pharisees are more and more angry. But again, it seems like, and I think there is strategy on this. So on Monday of the Passion Week, Jesus cleanses the temple for a second time. Folks, do you realize what he's doing? He is galvanizing the hatred of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And it's going to take him 5 days to get him on a cross. This is not accidental. Does that make sense to you? Delighted the Pharisees, angered the Sadducees for all of those months. Delighted the Sadducees, angered the Pharisees. But now, when he takes control, and folks, you got to understand, this is, I always say, imagine if the government can not do what they want to do, I guess. But if they were to announce that all retail stores had to close the day after Thanksgiving and couldn't open until January 5th or something, you say, oh man, that's a tough season. That's what's going on here. Jesus is shutting down this trade at that moment when So the point is that, now, I'm going to go further real quickly, and then we'll take a break. Here's the thing. Jesus cleanses the temple on Monday. He goes back to Bethany. Then on Tuesday, he comes in. Now, again, I just want you to understand that it's almost impossible to imagine. I don't know what happy analogy there might be. I was in Indianapolis when they won the Super Bowl. I just happened to be living there when they won the Super Bowl. And that was kind of the spirit. Everybody couldn't talk about anything else. Everybody was wearing their colors and so on. It's a dim analogy. But the fact is that it's almost impossible to imagine the level of excitement that gripped this city. And this city was swollen to several times its normal size. And there are various estimates, but undoubtedly at least 1 million people had come to Jerusalem and for the Passover. But at any rate, so that's on Monday. Tuesday, he returns. Now, his enemies have spent the night trying to come up with some way to derail, if you don't mind this, Jesus Express. And in our culture, you guys, what do you got to do, you young guys, What do you got to do to prove yourself a real man? You know, if you want to prove yourself a man among men, I don't know, you beat everybody in a room in arm wrestling or something like that. But in that culture, the way you prove yourself a man among men is to put your enemy to silence in open debate. Honest to goodness. And now Jesus' enemies come one by one. The Sadducees come and say, by what authority do you do these things? You know, they want him to say, I do this because I'm Messiah. Because they're longing to hear him openly claim to be Messiah king. Because then they can go to the Romans and say, you got a pretender king here. But Jesus is so clever. And this is rabbinical reasoning. I'd love to walk you through it. But Jesus simply says, I'll ask you a question. Perfectly legitimate. This is open debate. I'll ask you a question. The baptism of John, was it of heaven or of men? Seems kind of like, where'd that come from? Oh, that's genius. Because now the Sadducees put their heads together and they say, well, if we say that the baptism of John was of heaven, we got our answer. Because John announced him as Messiah. And if he's Messiah, he's got every right to the temple. Everybody knows that. But if we say that the baptism of John was of men, these people will kill us because they love John the Baptist. Oh, Jesus was so clever. And so they come back and they say, Master, we have no answer. The place would have erupted. There would have been catcalls and huzzas and applause, and the place would have erupted. This is a knockout. Then the Pharisees, the woman with the, paid tribute to Caesar, and Jesus, and they come back and they say, you have answered well. And then the Sadducees come back again with a woman with the 7 husbands. They're asking about the resurrection, and Jesus says, you don't know this. He proves the resurrection from the burning bush incident and so on. The point is, and in Luke 20, verse 40, the conclusion, it said, after that, no man dared ask him anything at all. Now, you've got to imagine that in terms of that culture and that situation where they were so angry with him, and their anger was galvanized, and they'd spend all night in their best minds and come up with the most, trying to trick him and catch him in his words, the Bible says. And he puts them all to silence. Oh, it's so big. And then Jesus argues from Psalm 110 for his own messiahship. He speaks these parables of condemnation about the son and the marriage and the vineyard and so on. And then you have this young man who comes and with a good heart says, what's the first and great commandment? Remember that? And Jesus answers that. But now, this is where I want to take you. Now we're going to take a break. In Matthew 23, and I'm sort of deliberating the question, given Sunday, why Friday? And I walk you through all this. And then here on page 10, I think, 7C, you have this last public discourse. But let me take you to Matthew 23. Now, let me just tell you 2 things I got to tell you. Number one, that's not what I want. Come on. Number one, understand this, folks, that Jesus, and this is, I give you early on, I didn't spend any time with it, might be helpful, a list of 10 important insights, and just kind of what I think are principles that are good to have in your mind. And one of them is that Jesus was he had a rhetorical strategy by which he would test what seemed to be the willingness of people to follow him. And he would simply put his finger on their most sensitive spiritual nerve. Does that make sense to you? You don't get to heaven by selling everything you have. But that rich young ruler said he wanted to follow Jesus. He said, okay, if that's what you feel, this is what I'm demanding of you. And he was testing his willingness. He did it again and again. I take you 4 or 5 places where it's explicit in the text. The big one is when you have a mass of Jewish people who seemed to be willing to follow Jesus. For instance, had welcomed him as king on Sunday morning. If Jesus wanted to test the genuineness of that allegiance, he would simply demand that they choose between him and the Pharisees. Because of everything I already told you. The Pharisees were revered. They were kind of our ticket into the kingdom. And this is the Sermon on the Mount. The key verse of the Sermon on the Mount is, let me just tell you this. I think both Matthew 23 and Matthew 5, if you're going to understand what's going on in those passages, picture Jesus pointing. And what I mean by that is this. In the Sermon on the Mount, here's this great mass of people. We can stand. I saw the picture there. And we can stand at the place where almost certainly Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. We understand the dynamics and so on. But the point is, there were people, and there were a lot of people who had broken their crutches over their knee that morning. You know what I'm saying? There were a lot of people who had come. Jesus had healed them and so on. But now Jesus goes up on the side of a hill where it's a natural acoustic theater. And I like to say that way over here in the corner is this little gaggle of really, really angry Pharisees. And you can see them a mile away. Their blue is bluer and their fringe is longer and so on. And here they stand. And Jesus says, Matthew 5, verse 20, unless your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you're never going to glimpse the kingdom of God. Now, folks, a gasp would have gone on. I'm back in Matthew 5. This is the Galilean ministry. But listen, the Pharisees loved to refer to one another. They would refer to themselves as gatekeepers. Hello, good morning, fellow gatekeepers, because they kept the law so perfectly. Not only they were certain to get into the kingdom, but God was going to give them the opportunity to decide who else got in. And for Jesus to say, they're not getting in. Now, what is Jesus doing there? Think about the Sermon on the Mount. The rest of the sermon, they say unto you, I say unto you. They say unto you, I say unto you. You've heard it said by those crooks, but I say unto you. And then the end of the Sermon on the Mount is, picture him pointing, there's a broad way, straight to destruction. Help yourself, or there's a narrow way. You can build your house on the sand. You're going to be destroyed, or you can build. Now, that's what he's doing in Matthew 23. Because, and I'm asking the question given Sunday, why Friday? And my answer is that Jesus, number one, I haven't made this point very carefully, but hear me. Jesus on Monday and Tuesday behaves more messianically than ever else in his life. Malachi 3 says explicitly that the Messiah, the messenger of the covenant, that's the new covenant, will come suddenly to his temple. Ezekiel has Messiah ruling in the temple. Every Jewish mind knows that the Messiah has every claim to the temple. And for Jesus to come in and claim the temple, and then for 2 days, there's no record of his possessing the temple in John 2 at the beginning, but now he possesses it for 2 days. And Mark says he wouldn't as much as allow a man to carry a vessel of water across the temple. I don't know exactly what it means, but that 36 acres, for 2 days, Jesus took control of it. Now, you can't imagine, especially to a Jewish mind, how he could more thoroughly claim the Messianic identity. That makes sense to you? But now, as he leaves sometime on Tuesday afternoon, this is his last discourse. You have Jesus spoke to the multitudes, and he's saying, you know, do what they say, but don't do what they do because they're crooks. And then you have these woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Now, just get in the moment. Imagine this now. All the excitement of this week. It's Passover, the city. Many people have come just because they heard about Lazarus and so on. Now the Nazarene does show up, and he rides in on Sunday. We welcome now. Monday he comes back, and he does it again. He took control of the temple. He ran those crooks out of there. But now on Tuesday afternoon, as he leaves the city, he stands there and again pointing, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You're like so many whited sepulchres. At Passover season, the rabbis had demanded that, had made a stand, you know, a law, as it were, that you had to go out and, you see, your tomb was generally just on somewhere on your property. It looked just like a cave. And it might get overgrown. You hadn't used it for several years, and somebody's on his way up to Passover, and he's kind of tired. He says, I'm going to take a rest. So he goes and sits there. Doesn't know it's your tomb. You come out and say, hey, I'm sorry, you're sitting next to Granddaddy's tomb. Now you're unclean. You can't go to Passover. So they had said that you had to whitewash your tombs. So they would just take some cheap lye and slop it on there just so people know. And Jesus says, you're like so many whitewashed tombs. You look good on the outside, but men just brush up against you and they become a stench in God's house. That's the idea. Unclean in the Bible. The Jewish mind doesn't deal with abstractions. It deals with concrete. And so it means you stink. If you're impure, you don't like people around you who stink, and God doesn't either. So that's what he's saying. You're full of dead men's bones. You're going to make people stink in the nose of God. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. You compass land and sea to make one proselyte, and when you got him, you make him twofold more the son of hell than he was before. These are not words calculated to endear Jesus to the Pharisaic fraternity. Can we agree on this? They are words calculated to make that city choose. Does that make sense to you? So I'm saying that what goes on, I didn't read very many of them, but they are, and he winds up by saying, woe on you brood of vipers. This is this conclusion at the end of this excoriation. And by the way, this word woe, W-O-E, is usually reserved for the prophets who cry out against this or that Gentile nation. But now he winds up by saying, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Now remember, they taught that the way to be assured of entrance into the kingdom is to keep the law, and they were the best people in the world at it. Jesus had come to put the lie to that claim. And so now he is doing what he has done again and again. He is using, if you don't mind, hard or demanding words to drive you to a choice. Does that make sense? That's Tuesday. Jesus is going to leave the city, go back to Bethany, and he's going to leave that city with a choice. Now, I think they've got a few days to ponder it. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Very early on Friday, very early, the word is going to go out that this one whom we welcomed as king, whom we cheered as he cleansed the temple, is now on trial for his life on the west side of the city before Pilate, and the city is going to wake up, and you can imagine with what wildfire speed that would have spread throughout the city, and they're going to gather there, and Pilate is going to give them a choice. Who would you have me release? And when they cry out, give us Barabbas, they are announcing their decision. I want you to see the connection. Jesus drove them to a choice. I like to say it this way, and then we're going to take a break here. Number one, on Sunday, Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem and genuinely, legitimately, fully qualified, offered himself as the long-awaited Messiah deliverer of Genesis 3:15. He offered himself, not only to the nation as their king, but to the Jews as their savior. Does that make sense to you? That's the message of Sunday. The message of Monday and Tuesday is this: you don't take Jesus on your terms. You take him on his terms. They were willing to take him on their terms. We're okay for the sin department. We don't need any help there, but we'd sure like some deliverance from Rome. Jesus, no, it doesn't work that way. So unless you're willing to turn your back on the self-righteous false gospel, the false gospel of self-righteousness preached by the Pharisees, you're not going to have Jesus. That makes sense to you? That's Tuesday. All right, let's take a break and